The land had grown quiet around Elias Carter. Too quiet, perhaps. The ranch lay like a forgotten prayer upon the edge of the New Mexico territory, where the horizon stretched wide enough to swallow a man's hope and leave him staring at the same circle of dust, season after season. 15 winters had passed since his wife was laid beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house, her grave marked only by a leaning stone and the weather-bleached ribbon of her old wedding dress, tied to a branch. 15 winters, and still the boards of the house remembered her footsteps more than his own. He lived mostly in silence now, a silence broken only by the groan of the wind through warped planks, the creak of his rocking chair, or the low murmur of coffee boiling black on the stove. He spoke little to anyone, less to himself. His hair had silvered at the temples, his hands had hardened to stone, and his eyes had grown accustomed to the stillness of a world that no longer wanted much from him. It was on such an evening, when the air burned orange with the dying light of autumn, that Elias saw them. He had been sitting in his chair, rifle across his lap, watching the shadows lengthen across the cotton fields gone to weed. At first, they were no more than specks along the ridge, riders moving slowly, cautiously, like a line of ghosts come down from the mesa. His stomach clenched with the instinct of an old frontier hand, for these were not settlers. The silhouettes bore the lean frames and high saddles of Apache scouts. He rose, boots crunching the brittle dirt of the yard, and leaned on the post of the porch. The horses descended with a steady rhythm, dust kicking around their legs, until he counted 6 riders in all. The men rode silent and wary, their faces carved hard against the glow of evening. But at their center rode a woman, straight-backed and unyielding. Elias's breath caught in his throat before he knew why. Her hair, bound in twin braids adorned with eagle feathers, shone dark as polished obsidian. Her gaze was direct, unflinching, though it carried the gravity of long journeys and unspoken burdens. She wore no sign of weakness, only the authority of one who had endured much and led others through the storm of it. Yet in the curve of her face, in the set of her jaw, Elias saw something that jarred against the silence of his memory. She was no stranger. Once, 15 years ago, he had carried a half-frozen girl into his cabin. He remembered the wolf's eyes, gleaming cruel and patient in the winter dark. He remembered the shawl torn around her shoulders, the tremble of her small hands, the sound of her shallow breaths as he laid her near the fire. He had not thought of her in years, at least not in any way that seemed real. Yet here she was, the child no longer, returned as a woman, and not merely a woman, but a chief. Her name came to him like a whisper from the ashes of memory. Nayeli. The riders halted at the edge of his yard. For a long time there was no sound except the restless shifting of horses, the faint rattle of tack, the low whine of the wind. Elias rested his hand on the stock of his rifle, not to raise it, but as a habit carved deep into his bones. He waited for them to speak. It was Nayeli who dismounted first. Her boots struck the dust softly, yet the act seemed to command the whole company. She walked forward, her braids stirring in the dusk air, her face grave. She stopped a short distance from him, where the porch shadows met the dying sun. "Elias Carter," she said, her voice low but steady. "You remember me?" He swallowed, the years collapsing like a deck of worn cards in his chest. "Aye," he answered, his voice rough with disuse. "I remember." For a moment the air between them seemed to quiver with something unsaid. He wanted to ask what had become of her in those long years, how she had risen from the frightened child to the figure who stood like carved stone before him. But her gaze allowed no such questions, no such indulgence in sentiment. "You saved me once," she said. The words carried neither gratitude nor accusation, only fact, laid upon the ground like a marker stone. "For that I came to speak my thanks." Elias nodded, uncertain if words would betray him. "You were a child," he murmured. "No man leaves a child to wolves." Something flickered across her eyes, unreadable. Perhaps a spark of memory, perhaps the faintest trace of softened thought. But it vanished as swiftly as it came. She inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, not warmth. Behind her, one of the scouts shifted restlessly, his eyes darting toward Elias with a glint of suspicion. The others kept still, their silence a wall around their chief. Nayeli's gaze lingered on him one moment longer, and then she said, "We will camp near the river. My people need rest before we travel on. Do not be troubled. We will not linger." It was spoken with courtesy, yet it was also a dismissal, a boundary drawn. Elias felt the words like a cold wind through his ribs. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was welcome, that she need not treat his land as though it were soil ready to betray her. But the years had stiffened his tongue. Instead, he gave a single nod, his face unreadable, his hands tightening against the porch rail. Nayeli turned, her shawl sweeping lightly against the dust as she mounted again. The riders wheeled, silent, and moved on toward the river, their shadows long against the crimson horizon. Elias stood on the porch long after they had gone, staring at the trail of dust settling into darkness. He felt the weight of 15 years pressing heavy upon him, not only the years of solitude, but the unfinished story that now circled back to his door. He had once saved a girl from the teeth of wolves. Now she had returned, not as a child, but as a chief who owed him nothing. The cold welcome lingered in the air like frost. The river carried a restless song that night. Elias could hear it from his porch, the low rush of water moving over stone mingling with the faint crackle of distant campfires. Nayeli and her people had settled along the bend where willows grew, their small encampment glowing like scattered embers against the dark. From where he sat, rocking slow in his chair, Elias could see little, only the faint silhouettes shifting near the flames. The shadows of horses tethered beneath the trees. It had been years since Apache voices drifted so close to his land, years since he had heard their songs carry into the night. The sound stirred something buried deep, something he had long pressed down with silence and labor. Memory, unwelcome but insistent, came upon him like a tide. He saw again the girl he had carried in his arms, her shawl shredded, her braids ragged from claws and cold, her breath faint as though death had already reached for her. Wolves had circled the ridge above, lean and starving, their eyes bright as lanterns in the snow. He had fired until the night broke with echoing shots, his rifle barrel burning against frozen hands. By the time the last wolf slunk back into the timber, the girl had collapsed in his arms. He remembered laying her near the fire, the cabin filling with the harsh rhythm of her coughing, the raw shiver of her small body. She had looked at him then, not with trust, but with fear edged in disbelief, as though she had expected his hand to turn cruel instead of kind. He had offered her broth, warmth, and silence, and in time she had slept, her face softening against the shadow of his late wife's quilt. That night had carved itself into his bones, though he had buried it beneath the weight of years. Now she returned, no longer frail. Her braids carried eagle feathers that spoke of battles and honor. Her voice commanded men who followed her without question. She was a chief, and he was nothing more than a man who had grown old in solitude, his house crumbling, his name little more than a spit on the lips of the town. The settlers had wasted no time in their muttering. That afternoon, Elias had gone into town for supplies, and he had heard their voices. "Apache devils roosting near Carter's place," one man sneered. "No wonder he lives alone. He'd rather break bread with wolves than with decent folk." Another had muttered, "That rancher's forgotten which side of the grave he belongs on." Their eyes had burned with suspicion, their mouths full of poison, and Elias had walked away without answering. He had no fight left for them, and no care for their judgment. The land had taught him long ago that the world measured worth not by truth, but by rumor. Still, their words clung to him as he watched the glow by the river. He knew what they wanted, trouble. They feared what they did not understand, and they would rather see Nayeli's people hunted than sheltered. The U.S. cavalry rode patrols not far from these hills, eager to make an example of those who refused to bow. It was only a matter of time before the soldiers caught wind of the camp. Elias shifted in his chair, the old wood groaning beneath him. He wondered what she thought of him now, this woman who had survived so much. Did she remember him as a savior, or only as another settler with a rifle? Did she believe he had acted from kindness, or had she carried the thought all these years that he pitied her, as the world often did to those left half dead. Down by the river, Nayeli sat apart from her men. Elias could see her outline when the firelight flared, her figure wrapped in a dark shawl, her face turned toward the water. She did not laugh, did not speak much, though her presence held the camp together like a spine holds the body. Her dignity was armor, her silence a shield. She was not the girl trembling beneath a quilt. She was the woman who had risen from it. Yet when Elias closed his eyes, he saw her then and now layered together, the child whose braids had been ragged, the chief whose braids bore feathers of strength. Two lives bound by a single night of wolves and firelight. He realized, slowly, that what had seemed to him a fleeting act of mercy had shaped her in ways he could not measure. For her, that night was not charity. It was proof, however small, that one settler's hand could hold something other than contempt. Perhaps it had planted in her the seed of belief that survival was possible not only against the teeth of animals, but against the teeth of men, and yet she kept her distance. Her words to him earlier had been guarded, her thanks more a duty than a gift. She had not softened her tone, nor lingered in his yard. Her pride was intact, and he could not fault her for it. He too lived behind walls built of grief and silence. He too had learned that closeness often carried the weight of loss. The night deepened. Elias rose at last, carrying his lantern inside, but he did not sleep quickly. He sat at the table, tracing the grain of old wood with calloused fingers, listening to the faint rise and fall of the river song beyond the walls. Shadows of the past crowded him, and he found no way to push them back. Outside, in the glow of her camp, Nayeli sat by the fire, her eyes following the sparks as they rose into the sky. In her heart she carried her own memory of that night long ago, the warmth of a fire when she had expected none, the rough hands that had set broth before her without cruelty, the man who had not looked at her as a burden. She did not call it kindness. She called it the first time she believed she might survive. Still, she told no one of this. Her warriors saw only their chief, silent and strong, and she allowed no other image. Her heart, too, was scarred, and she hid it as carefully as Elias hid his grief. They were two shadows cast across the same ground, both shaped by what had been lost, both carrying the weight of survival. Neither yet willing to step into the firelight of what might still be. The storm rolled in without warning, as storms often do on the frontier. One moment the sky was sharp and brittle blue, the sun pale over the ridge. The next, clouds swelled black and heavy, dragging snow out of the heavens in furious sheets. The wind came howling down the valley, rattling boards, snapping branches, and driving the cold into bone. Elias had seen enough winters to know when the land meant to bury him alive. He had been chopping wood when the first flakes thickened, his breath a ghost in the air, his axe biting into the frozen stump. By the time he looked up, the world was already blotted white, the mesa hidden, the cottonwood bowed under weight. He carried the last of the wood inside, bolting the door as the first true gale struck the house like a fist. Through the snow's roar, faint shapes approached, horses laboring, men bent against the wind. A shawl drawn tight around a woman's face. Nayeli and her people had been caught in the storm. There was no question of turning them away. Not when the storm howled like wolves. Not when the snow could swallow whole lives before morning. Elias opened his door wide. The cold rushed in, bringing with it 6 figures dusted white, their breath ragged. Horses were left tethered to the lee side of the barn, their flanks steaming, their eyes rolling wild at the scent of storm and the distant cry of prowling wolves. Inside, the cabin became a refuge pressed too tight. The space was built for one man's silence, not for a band of warriors and their chief. Boots stamped the floor, wet shawls shook out snow, and the air grew thick with damp leather and wood smoke. Elias set his lanterns alight, their glow trembling against log walls, and stoked the stove until iron rang with heat. He brewed coffee strong as iron, the kind that scalded the tongue and steadied the blood. The men accepted the tin cups reluctantly, their eyes never leaving him. Elias drank first, as if to prove the brew was no trick. Only then did they follow, though some muttered in Apache beneath their breath. Nayeli sat apart, shawl slipping from her shoulders as she drew from her satchel a bundle of worn moccasins. Her hands worked deftly, stitching torn seams with practiced ease. She did not speak, but her silence held more weight than words. The firelight caught on the eagle feathers in her braids, casting shadows across her cheekbones. She looked at home beside the fire, yet distant, as though her spirit sat outside with the storm. Tension coiled beneath the roof like smoke refusing to rise. Elias felt it in every shift of the warriors' eyes, in the way their hands never strayed far from the knives at their belts. They sat close together, speaking in murmurs, their voices taut. He knew what they thought, that to share a settler's roof was to risk betrayal. And he knew too what the town would say if word reached them. Already they had cursed his name for tolerating her presence by the river. Now, if they knew she and her warriors slept beneath his roof, they would spit on his doorstep, call him traitor, drive him deeper into exile than solitude already had. The storm thickened, the house shuddering against the gale. Snow piled at the shutters, rattled at the chimney, pressed into every crack. Outside, wolves lifted their voices, thin and wild, carried by the wind. The sound bent Elias back into memory, the same mournful howl circling a child in the dark, a rifle bucking in his hands, blood steaming on snow. He rose, bolted the door tight, and laid his rifle across the mantel within reach. Nayeli's eyes followed him, her needle stilling in her hands. She said nothing, but the silence between them was heavy as stone. Firelight flickered across her face, shifting her expression, at once strong, unreadable, and yet edged with something softer, something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or merely vigilance. Hours dragged slow. The storm did not ease. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of snow. The windows blurred white. The men shifted uneasily, whispering of spirits in the storm. Elias sat steady in his chair, boots planted, rifle near. He did not speak, only watched the flames lick higher, and in them the face of the woman who had once been a trembling girl. The cabin felt at times too small, as though the weight of history pressed the walls inward. Two worlds shared the same fire, and neither could yet set down its burdens. When at last the hour grew late, the warriors stretched themselves on the floorboards, shawls pulled over shoulders, knives laid within reach of their hands. Nayeli remained upright, her sewing finished, her moccasins folded neatly beside her. She did not sleep. Elias did not either. Their eyes met across the fire, the storms howling between them, the past alive in the cries of wolves. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Both knew that the storm had forced them together, that the night demanded unity whether their hearts welcomed it or not. The walls of the cabin became not just wood and nails, but fragile trust holding danger at bay, trust that might splinter if tested, but for now was enough to keep the dark from swallowing them whole. Elias leaned back at last, his chair creaking, his gaze still on her face as shadows flickered. She watched him too, though her eyes gave nothing away. Outside, the wolves sang to the storm. Inside, two lives once bound by chance were pressed once more into uneasy shelter, and the night held them, not yet close, but not apart. The storm did not pass quickly. By the second day, the world outside was smothered white, the drifts climbing to the windowsills, the barn roof sagging beneath the weight. The cabin groaned with each gust of wind, timbers straining as though the whole house fought against being buried alive. The storm was not only of snow and wind, it was of silence, of suspicion, of things left unsaid too long. Elias felt it pressing on him as he moved about the cabin, tending the fire, measuring rations, mending the latch on the back door. He heard the murmurs of her men when they thought he could not understand. Their voices were low, sharp with doubt. They questioned whether he had drawn them into a trap, whether he had called soldiers down upon them, whether his silence hid malice. Every glance they gave him was heavy with judgment. He said nothing, only endured it as he had endured many things, with clenched jaw and quiet labor. But the words clung like burrs, and each whisper cut deeper than he wished to admit. Nayeli heard whispers too. Not here, but when one of her scouts returned from town. He had slipped away to gather word and came back with his face dark as thunder. Settlers had gathered at the saloon, speaking Elias's name with spit in their voices. They called her people strays fit for the noose, outlaws who deserved no roof, no fire, no peace. They said Carter had lost his mind, harboring wolves in his own den. One man swore that once the storm passed, he'd ride with the cavalry and see them all strung up by law or rope. The words reached Nayeli like stones thrown across the river. She kept her composure, but inside her chest a fire smoldered. Rage, yes, but also sorrow that the world had not changed since she was a girl. To them she was still less than human. To them she was a threat simply because she endured. That night, the storm roared loud enough to drown the wolves' howls. The fire inside the cabin spat sparks, flames bending against the draft that snuck through the logs. Elias sat in his chair, his rifle resting against the mantel, his eyes on the flames. Across from him, Nayeli sat on a low stool, her shawl drawn close, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the fire. The silence between them was heavy, brittle, near breaking. It was she who shattered it first. "You keep watch over us like a jailer," she said, her voice steady but edged. "Do you believe we would slit your throat while you sleep?" Elias did not look up at first. He let the firelight dance on his scarred hands before he answered. "I keep watch because the storm does not. And because men in this country, whether settler or Apache, have learned that trust is thin ice. It breaks easy." Her eyes narrowed. "No, you keep watch because you pity us, just as you pitied me once. To you, we are always the ones shivering in the snow, waiting for scraps of mercy." At that, his gaze snapped to hers. For a moment, his face was stone, unreadable. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low but fierce. "Pity? No, I never pitied you." He let the words hang heavy. "You were a child. A child is worth saving always. That night, I did not see an Apache girl. I saw a life that should not end beneath teeth and cold. If that is pity, then I have nothing else to give." Nayeli's jaw tightened, but her eyes flickered, as though something in his tone struck deeper than she wished. Still, she did not yield. "And after that night? You forgot me. You buried me in your silence." He looked down into the flames. His voice softened, weary. "I buried everything. My wife, my own worth, my life. Loneliness is a wolf that never lets go, Chief. It circles you, follows you, gnaws at you, until there's nothing left but bones. Saving you that night. Perhaps it was the only good act I carried out of this broken life. And then I went on breathing, but I didn't go on living. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the shutters. Her face was shadowed, unreadable, but her hands had stilled upon her shawl. "You think loneliness belongs only to you?" she said at last, her voice quieter now, though no softer. "Do you think being chief spared me from it? I bury children. I bury mothers. I bury men who followed me because they believed I could lead them to peace. And still the soldiers come, and still the towns curse us. I endure, but I do not live either. Not as you mean it." Their words hung in the air, heavy as the storm pressing against the roof. For a long while neither spoke. The warriors had long since lain down, their breathing slow, their trust placed only in their chief's wakefulness. The two by the fire were alone in the weight of truth. Something cracked then, not tenderness, not comfort, but recognition. A fragile thread of understanding pulled taut between them. He saw beneath her bearing the same ache he carried, the cost of surviving when others did not. She saw beneath his silence a man carved hollow by loss, not a jailer, not a traitor, but a shadow of the life he once had. The storm raged on. Yet for the first time since the snow had fallen, the silence in the cabin did not feel like a prison. It felt like a mirror. Elias leaned back, weary, staring at the fire. Nayeli lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around her shawl. They said no more, but both knew something had shifted. They were not allies, not friends, not yet. But they were alike in exile, alike in the burdens that weighed heavier than snow. Two survivors bound by what had been taken, each seeing in the other the reflection of their own wounds. The storm had broken by the third night. The winds fell silent, leaving only the heavy stillness of snow blanketing the land in white silence. The cabin, weary from days of strain, seemed almost to exhale. Elias had gone out earlier, breaking paths from door to barn, while Nayeli's people moved quietly, mending gear and sharpening blades. The air between them all was easier now, not friendly, but less brittle. It felt, for the first time, like survival was possible. But survival, Elias knew, was never safe for long in these borderlands. And he was right. The attack came with the dark, sudden as a match struck in dry tinder. Shouts rang first, harsh voices not in Apache tongue but in the rough drawl of men who knew no law but hunger and greed. Gunshots cracked. Horses screamed. The cabin shook with the slam of a rifle butt against the shutters. Then came the smell of smoke, sharp and rising. The outlaws had fired the barn, and the flames leapt fast into the night. Elias was on his feet before thought, rifle in hand, his breath cold in his chest. "Outlaws!" he barked, though no one in the cabin needed telling. Nayeli's warriors were already at the windows, their eyes lit fierce by firelight. Bows and rifles raised, the door burst wide, splinters flying, and the world became thunder. Elias fired first, the recoil slamming his shoulder, the outlaw in the doorway collapsing into snow. Another came in after, only to be met by the hiss of Nayeli's blade flashing in the light. She moved with the precision of a hawk, her braid whipping behind her as she drove the man back into the storm. Her voice, sharp as command, rang out in Apache, and her men answered, their weapons spitting fire. The air filled with smoke and sparks, the roof timbers glowing red as stray flames licked upward. Elias moved without thought, loading, firing, shouting warnings. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, and yet could not bear to lose what fragile ground they had made. Through the chaos he saw her, Nayeli, framed by firelight, rifle against her shoulder, calm as stone. She shot clean without waste, her jaw set, her eyes burning. She did not look like a child saved once in the snow. She looked like fire itself, consuming, unyielding. Then came the cry, the sound of one of her men falling, a young warrior whose chest had caught a bullet. The boy crumpled beside the hearth, blood staining the rough boards. Nayeli turned, her face stricken, but even grief did not break her focus. She pressed on, her rifle thundering, her commands holding the others steady. Elias moved to cover them. Another outlaw had slipped past, aiming low at one of Nayeli's scouts crouched near the door. Without thought, Elias threw himself forward, shouldering the younger man down and taking the blow across his ribs. The bullet tore hot, burning through cloth and flesh, but did not drop him. He rose with a snarl, driving his rifle butt into the outlaw's jaw, sending him crumpling to the firelit floor. Pain seared through him, yet he stood. He had been hollow for so long. But in that instant his body remembered something his heart had forgotten. The instinct to protect. To live not just for himself, but for another. The fight blurred into smoke and blood. Shots rang, screams carried, the flames raged higher. Yet little by little, the outlaws broke, staggering back into the storm, dragging their wounded. One cursed loud and bitter, swearing vengeance, before the snow swallowed them all. The night grew still again, broken only by the moan of wind and the crackle of the burning barn. When it was done, Elias staggered against the wall, breath raw in his chest. Nayeli lowered her rifle, her hands trembling now that the killing was over. Her shawl was torn, her arm bloodied by a shallow cut. Her eyes found him across the smoke-filled room, and for a moment all else fell away. The dead, the fire, the ruin. She crossed to him. "You're hurt," she said, her voice stripped of command now, softer, though no less steady. Elias looked down at the blood seeping through his shirt, shrugged as though it were nothing. "I've had worse." But his knees threatened to betray him, and when she reached to steady him, he did not pull away. Together they sank to the floor beside the hearth, where the fire burned low but steady. The storm had taken their walls, the raiders had taken their peace, but here in the ruin there was still warmth. Nayeli's hands, calloused and scarred, pressed cloth against his wound. He hissed through his teeth but did not move. Her touch lingered longer than necessity, as though some part of her, chief though she was, carved hard by loss, remembered that night long ago, when he had knelt in snow and lifted her small, half-frozen body from the jaws of wolves. The memory burned in both of them, though neither spoke it. Instead, she met his eyes, and for the first time there was no wall, no guarded distance. Only fire reflected in fire. He reached then, not bold, not desperate, only steady, and took her wrist lightly. His hand was rough, hers steady, and for a moment neither pulled away. It was not passion, not yet, but something rarer, recognition, the faint, dangerous spark of belonging. Outside, the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, flames rising into the dark. The fire had destroyed, yes, but it had also revealed. It had shown her the man who shielded others without thought, who fought not from rage, but from something deeper. It had shown him the woman who bore her people's grief, and still stood unbroken. When the last ember fell, they remained together in the hush, two scarred souls who had lived too long in the shadows of their own losses. And though the night was cold, the fire between them burned still. The dawn after the raid broke hollow and grey. Smoke still curled from the ruins of the barn, the charred frame leaning like a broken rib against the horizon. Elias stood in the snow, his coat pulled tight, breath smoking in the cold, his ribs bound where Nayeli had stitched him. Her people were silent, tending to the body of the fallen youth. They wrapped him in a blanket patterned with his family's colors, tying the edges with rawhide, their voices low as they sang a mourning song. The air was heavy with loss, but heavier still with the promise of what was to come. Elias felt it before he heard it, the distant thunder of hooves, the clink of iron, the harsh bark of orders shouted on the wind. The cavalry was coming. By the time the riders crested the rise, snow flying from their horses' hooves, every man and woman in the yard had risen to meet them. A column of blue coats, rifles glinting, sabers flashing. The officer at their head rode tall, his mustache bristling, his voice sharp as he called, "Apache! Lay down your arms. You are under the authority of the United States government." The warriors stiffened, their hands tight on their rifles. Nayeli stepped forward, the eagle feathers in her braids stirring in the wind. Her voice, steady as stone, answered back. "We are not raiders. We have spilled no settler blood. We seek only to bury our dead and ride on," the officer sneered. "You'll ride only to the fort. Orders are orders." From behind, settlers of the nearby town had gathered, drawn by smoke and rumor. Their voices hissed like snakes. "Hang 'em! Thieves, killers, savages." Elias caught his name among their curses, spit like poison. "That rancher harbors them." "Traitor." Elias's jaw tightened. He had bent his back to those settlers for years, hauling freight, trading cattle, standing silent while they muttered over his loneliness. Now he saw their faces clear in the morning light, small, mean, afraid. They wanted him to hand Nayeli over, to wash his hands clean and go back to his rocking chair and his ghosts. But Elias Carter was done with silence. He stepped forward, rifle in hand, planting himself between the soldiers and Nayeli's people. His voice, rough with smoke and years, carried across the yard. "They'll not go with you," he said. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Step aside, rancher. You'd pit yourself against the government? Against your own people?" Elias's grip tightened on the rifle, the wood warm against his palm. "My people?" He spat the words bitter as gall. "My people buried my wife in the ground and left me to rot in a house of dust. My people call me traitor for offering a roof against the storm. If these are my people, I've no need of them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some cursed, others shifted uneasily. The officer raised his hand. "You'd risk your life for them?" "For her?" Elias looked at Nayeli then. She stood still, her chin lifted, her eyes unreadable but burning with something deeper than command. For a long moment, the wind carried nothing but silence between them. Then Elias spoke, his words steady. "I saved her once, long ago. Not from pity. Not from some fool's fancy. I saved her because no child deserves to be torn by wolves. That's the only good thing I've carried from a broken life. I'll not let you steal survival from her again. Not while I've breath." Nayeli stepped closer, her hand lifting in quiet restraint. "Enough, I will go with them." Her voice cut clean through the air. Her warriors cried out in protest, but she silenced them with a look. "If my people's freedom demands my chains, I will pay that price. I will not see more die." But Elias shook his head, his eyes blazing for the first time in years. "No, you'll not give yourself over like some offering to their fear. You're no prisoner, Nayeli. You're a chief, and I'll not stand by while they break what you've built. The standoff grew sharp as glass. Soldiers shifted in their saddles, rifles leveled. The settlers pressed closer, voices rising. Nayeli's warriors stood tense, every finger on a trigger, every breath one heartbeat from bloodshed. Then, like a mercy, the storm broke. The wind shifted, tearing the clouds apart, spilling sudden light over the valley. Snow glittered under the rising sun, bright as a blessing. In the silence of that moment, the officer seemed to waver. Perhaps it was the fire in Elias's eyes, or the unbending steel in Nayeli's stance, or the weight of the dawn itself. But he lowered his hand. "Ride," he muttered at last, spitting into the snow. "Bury your dead, then ride. But pray we don't cross again." He wheeled his horse, his men turning with him, their column retreating down the valley. The settlers, denied their spectacle, scattered like crows. Only silence remained. Silence and smoke, and the sound of a morning song lifting once more into the air. By dawn's full light, Nayeli's people were mounted, their fallen wrapped and bound across a horse's back. They would ride east, back toward their land, their grief heavy but their freedom intact. Nayeli lingered by the barn ruins, her gaze on Elias. She said little. Words seemed too small now, but she stepped to his horse, stroking its mane. From her braid she drew a single eagle feather, binding it there with rawhide. A silent gift, a mark not of debt, but of kinship. Elias watched her, his throat tight. No promise was spoken, no farewell carved in stone. Yet he knew as he watched her mount that something in him had shifted. The hollowness he had carried was not gone, but it no longer rang so empty. She had left a piece of her fire with him, just as he had given her his defiance. When they rode away, their figures dwindling against the snow, Elias did not follow. He stood before the ashes of his cabin, the wind in his coat, the feathers stirring in his horse's mane. For the first time in 15 winters, he did not feel forgotten. And somewhere beyond the horizon, he knew she no longer carried the weight of abandonment either. Two exiles had found each other in the fire and the storm, and though divided by worlds, they would carry one another's shadows into whatever years remained. Elias turned toward the ruin, the day bright upon the snow, and felt in his chest the faint, dangerous warmth of life beginning again.